and welcome to the first of Planted Country's Save Our Soils talks, brought to you in association with the National Trust and filmed on the deck of our beautiful handmade off-grid cabin, designed and created by our friends from out of the valley. My name's Oliver Heath and I'm the Biophilic Design Advisor for Planted, the only design event aimed at reconnecting people, spaces and nature. At Planted, we wanted to make the commercial case for taking a nature-first approach in all aspects of our lives to create cleaner, greener and a more sustainable future. In this series of talks, we're exploring why the earth is so important for food, farming and nature, and asking what role design can play in encouraging the use of local materials and reducing the demand for already overstretched natural resources. So today we're discussing the subject of why Earth matters. Now it's said, albeit by the Minnesota Farmers Association, that we owe our human existence to a 6-inch layer of topsoil and the fact that it rains. But clearly this simple statement belies the enormous complexity of the soils beneath our feet and the issues that face them as a result of human activity and industrialized farming. Distressingly, we apparently only have 60 harvests left if we keep acting and farming in the way that we do. So clearly our approach to this natural element that has sustained life for millennia has gone drastically wrong. Now, a handful of soil has more living organisms in it than there are people on the planet. Soil is the stomach of the earth, consuming, digesting, cycling nutrients and organisms. But what exactly is the soil made of? And how do we stop our current trajectory and change our approach to this most important and fundamental foundation of all life on Earth? Well, today we have a most brilliant, knowledgeable, experienced set of speakers to discuss and investigate just that. We have Toby Diggens from Digg Co, John Stannard from Heath Rewilding, and John Deakin, who's the head of trees, which is just the most brilliant job title at the National Trust. Now, each speaker is going to introduce themselves for 5 to 10 minutes, and then we're going to have a little panel discussion for about half an hour, and after that we're going to have time for some questions from the audience. So keep them in mind, and I would stress questions, not statements, would be brilliant. And there's a roving mic that will come around when we're ready to do that. So initially I think we're going to start off from Toby. If you'd like to just kind of tell the audience a little bit about yourself, your experience and your passion about the subject.
Sure. Well, thanks, Oliver. Thanks very much. Hello, everybody. My name's Toby Diggins, and I'm a landscape architect. I run a design practice called Digg Co Studio. We're based down in Devon, and it's pretty awesome to be here in a landscape that was designed by Henry Hoare. As a landscape architect, you can't help but be amazed at some of the thoughts that people have had about how to think of landscape in the past. And yeah, it's just an honour to be here, really. So thanks very much. So my design studio kind of works between the intersection of natural restoration and landscape architecture. For all of those who know what traditional landscape architects do, we tend to work mainly at the moment in more urban areas, rethinking urban spaces and places. Some landscape architects also work in the rural domain and work on sort of larger garden design projects and landscape design. But my backstory is that I'm also a marine biologist, and I studied marine biology at Newcastle University and was sort of made aware of a lot of the ecological issues which are happening in the ocean, obviously, but there were a rundown from the land. And strangely enough, I couldn't really find a creative enough job in marine biology, and so I then retrained as a landscape architect because I had a little bit of an artistic streak, and I realised that landscape architecture could tell the story of what was going on ecologically very strongly, and obviously landscape architects are very often involved in the transformation of land, be it good or bad, so it seemed like a very nice place to be with regards to actually having a hand in things. And to sort of surmise where my practice has got to since I founded it in 2016, we're now involved in 2 or 3 really large ecological restoration projects, one of which is called the Wenling Beck Environment Project in Norfolk. It's a 2,000 acre restoration project which is looking to basically restore biodiversity on a pretty big level. We're using all sorts of different funding mechanisms to make that happen, but the underpinnings of it is that the soil and the life that the soil supports above ground is absolutely fundamental to how that restoration goes about. So I'm sure we'll get on to more about the soil. It is absolutely the most fundamental thing that we can sustain and build, and I'm just very grateful and happy to be in the space I'm in to be able to be a part of that restoration. So
Great.
There we go.
Thank you. Jan.
Morning everyone, aren't we lucky to be here under this beautiful sky? Just lovely to be amongst you. I'm Jan Stannard and I was about 8 when I, through a neighbour or family who are neighbours, really became passionate about nature, particularly birds, and that was, I think of that experience as being the seed that went inside me, and it's sort of been growing ever since. It's always been there. When I was in the Brownies, I'm sure some of you in the Brownies, I remember making a tawny owl out of a sock. And I've still got that. It's looking a bit moth-eaten now, but I think that, I really did have a love of nature. So went through my life. I did a geography degree, which has only recently come in handy. So I carried this love of nature through my life, but I went into business. So I've had a 40-year career in business. And then as the state of the climate and nature really began to get to me, I thought, I've got to stop. I'm privileged, I can stop now and do something meaningful that means I can spend the rest of my time on Earth saying I've done something that matters. And in about 2017-18, I began to think, how could I make the greatest impact with others? And realised that there was no organisation that was dedicated to acquiring new sites for nature where nature could recover using rewilding as the method. And with that idea, and the other was that everyone should be able to do this together. So if you were someone with £1 or someone with £10 million, together we could make this happen. So the idea of what became Heal was born. Heal Rewilding was born. We launched in about 2 years ago, so we're a toddler charity, so a registered charity. And our mission is to heal the land, heal nature and heal ourselves. So nature restoration using rewilding as the method. So who in the audience has heard the word rewilding? Apart from a couple of little children, I think that's everybody. And who maybe doesn't know exactly what it is? Few people confessing. Okay. So nature recovery on its broadest sense, which is the restoration of fully functioning ecosystems. So one of the really important shifts that many of us are making is that you look out onto, I'm not saying this landscape particularly, but onto green landscape and you think, how beautiful. But that's an aesthetic judgment, not a judgment of the health of the landscape you're seeing. And most of the landscapes in England where Heal is focused are depleted of nature. And so Heal is helping nature, helping climate change through rewilding, because it makes the ecosystems more resilient, and there's more growth, so that captures more carbon, soil carbon improves, and well-being. So we're going to acquire sites. We want to have a site in every county in England, 48 sites. That's 25,000 acres at the scale we want, which is about 500 acres. I won't be alive to see it, but I thought when we launched of organisations like the National Trust and RSPB that set up many decades ago, and if you want land to be given back to nature in perpetuity, I'm just I'm just a temporary custodian of that with my trustees, our trustees, and things will move forward. So that's our mission: raise money, buy land, rewild it, and we're on track to acquire our first site this year if the right place comes up, with buildings. And so they'll be open to the public, free to enter, and a place to come and enjoy, we hope, the sound of some of the birds we've lost, the sight of some of the butterflies we don't see so much, and just a place of absolute joy. So when we open, we hope we welcome you to our first Heal site and any site thereafter. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. And John.
Good morning, everyone. It's really nice to see you all here. I feel slightly pressured. I mean, Oliver's described us as expert, so maybe in trees, not so much soil. So,
I think it was more relative to myself.
I will do my best. So I'm John. I'm the head of trees and woodlands at the National Trust. I've been a chartered forester for a long time. I trained in forestry at the University of Aberdeen, and trees and woodlands have been my life throughout all my professional career. For the last 2.5 years, I've had the privilege of being the head of trees and woodlands for the National Trust, and it truly is a remarkable organisation. We have about 25,000 hectares or 75,000 or 70,000 acres or so of woodlands, as well as another 50,000 hectares of wooded habitats, covering the whole suite of different things, from urban trees to parkland trees, wood pasture, forests, woodlands, you name it, and an amazing collection of veteran and ancient trees as well, which we're privileged to be custodians of. And throughout my career, soils have always played an important part in how we think about woodlands and woodland management. But when I started off, it was much more in the sort of technical sort of way around sort of how you can choose the right species to meet the right soil types. It's quite a mechanistic type of relationship, and I did soil science at university. But it wasn't really until I moved to Windsor as a chief forester, and I met an individual over there, actually sitting in the crowd, Ted Green, who had a profound influence on me and really made me think about soils in a very different way, about them being a really symbiotic and living organism in their own right, which without them, the trees that we sort of revere and we look after and we look to just wouldn't be there, and they wouldn't stand any chance of being resilient to climate change and all the other problems that we're facing at the moment without a healthy soil underneath their feet. And one of the things that Ted and I did at that time was we set up the first forest soil reserve at Windsor, and then we set up another organic nursery. And it's really, I'm really proud to think that sort of discussions that I had with Ted, sitting on my desk in Windsor on regular occasions, provoking and talking about the impact that we can have, and talking about soils and their relevance to trees and woodlands, still has a profound influence on how we think about things in the National Trust now. And for the National Trust itself, we've got very significant ambitions to restore nature across our land. We've got about 250,000 hectares of land across England, Wales and Northern Ireland. And a huge part of our strategy is to restore 25,000 hectares of priority habitats. But in addition to that, also to establish 20 million trees over the next sort of 7 or 8 years. And that's not woodland planting, that's about establishing trees in their widest forms, from agroforestry through to urban trees, through to natural colonisation, and then some traditionally planted woodlands as well. So the whole suite of wooded habitats we might want to see to give nature the best chance of thriving in the face of climate change. So thank you for the opportunity, Oliver.
Great, thank you. Just going back to your kind of initial statement, you said that you studied soil science. For those that don't know, could you just tell us a little bit more about the makeup of soil, and what are we essentially talking about here? Because for all intents and purposes, other than whatever's growing above it, it appears very static to probably a majority of the population.
Yeah, so when you study, well, certainly when I studied soil science at university, it was really about soil chemistry and about the sort of structure of the soils, whether it's kind of like a peaty soil or an organic soil, or whether it's a podzolic soil or a glacial soil. And you talk about those basic parameters and structures of those soils and how those things would affect the trees that you might plant on them. But what you quickly come to realise is that there's much more to soil, as we've talked about. That they are full of incredibly complex symbiotic relationships, from mycorrhizal fungi through to tiny invertebrates and all sorts of different things, as well as bacteria, all of which function together to create this incredible, sort of living, almost organism, if you look at it as one great piece, which then have a symbiotic relationship with many of the things that then grow out of the soil, the things that we see, the grasses, the trees and various other things. And without those complex interactions and understanding those, we really don't have any chance of making sure that we value and protect them in that way.
Okay, thank you. Toby, in what ways are we mistreating our soils?
Well, in many ways, we're mistreating our soils. As John so eloquently says, the soil is essentially the harbinger or the holder of the sort of ecological knowledge of land. And I think if we just focus on how we grow our food as an example of one of the mistreatments we have over the last sort of 70 to 100 years, fundamentally altered the shape of the soil by disengaging the biology which needs to be interwoven, as John was saying, to actually transfer nutrients from one plant to another. And we've supplanted it with a chemical agriculture which has essentially destroyed that living function. And I know a lot of people would say, well, how do you grow soil, or how do you grow food now without the use, or how do you produce high yielding crops without the use of chemicals? The reality is that the soils that people are probably trying to go organic on or try and go regenerative on are so depleted it actually takes potentially many years to get that soil biology back. And so as more of like a positive note for the future, one of the absolutely crucial things we can do to stop that depletion is to begin the process of weaning ourselves off chemical agriculture as quickly as possible. And once that does occur, the natural process of ecological succession from essentially a standing start will begin again. And of course there are some amazing scientists at the moment like Dr. Elaine Ingham, who are working on almost inoculants of biology, within which you have the fungi, you have the bacteria, you've got nematodes, protists, protozoa, tardigrades, lots of wonderful creatures which live within the soil as if it's like the rainforest beneath our feet. And once we start to reinsert those elements of biology and therefore chemical function and flow, we will actually see the richness of that land come back again. So that's one of the ways, but I mean, there's lots.
Yeah. So these chemicals are essentially what? Who are the kind of the worst offenders?
Well, I think it's quite hard to say who's actually the worst of the worst.
Pick your top three.
I think fungicides are really bad because they destroy that living thread between plants. Similarly, just growing in a monoculture is very tough for plants to recognise the ability to transfer the correct nutrients from one to another. So you might have heard of people using diverse cover cropping systems outside of their standard row cropping, or outside of the periods where they're growing crops, to restore a bit of soil function. And that's absolutely necessary because every single plant is actually exuding different nutrients into the soil and therefore being paid back by the fungi and the bacteria which are symbiotically in relationship with them in the soil. So I think fungicides in general are unfortunate because the mycorrhizal, which is this network of life that's running underneath, the mycelium that's running underneath the soil, is being depleted by that. And of course, the research has probably never gone to the point of looking out beyond just what you're trying to kill, which I think is always our big mistake, is that we recognise that we've solved a problem by killing off a rust fungus, for example. But in the process, a bit like taking antibiotics, you're probably also blitzing other fungi which are actually highly important. So I think fungicides in general, I wouldn't be able to name any. I don't actually know the names of them. And I think that Roundup and glyphosate is pretty desperate. I've done some really interesting restorations over the last 4 years where glyphosate's evidently been used on soils to burn off crops to then plant something else. And the soil biology is so destroyed that the plants you would have expected to be quite profuse, like the grasses and the early successional weeds, have actually been tiny. And that's, again, because of the process of them putting their roots down into a world that they don't understand. As soon as a seed germinates, it's sending out root tip hairs that are looking for fungi to attach to and bacteria to become reliant on for that transfer of nutrients. And when they don't have that, they're essentially growing in sand. So yeah, I think those are the two key ones. I think the cocktail is obviously a big problem as well of multiple types of chemicals joining in to create or actually probably stop pathways that need to happen for life to occur. But yeah.
Okay, and Jan, you mentioned that you're looking for a site right now. What constitutes the right site? I mean, are you hearing Toby and hearing a lot of the things that you're actually looking for to challenge?
And before I answer that, I just wanted to pick up on soil. The other two things we haven't mentioned, I don't think, have been erosion and compaction, which are the other two things that are happening to soils. So there are lots of things that we do to soils that don't do them any good. But we're looking for recovery. So the sorts of sites we're going to want will be places where the ecology is depleted to the extent that recovery is going to be the best thing that we can do for it. And one of the things that we have in HEAL's policy is that if we were ever to be in food crisis or in a war situation, we would give back our land for food production, were that to be necessary. Otherwise, it's going to be for nature in perpetuity. And if we were to give it back, it would be in a lot better state after some while than it would be. But there's a sort of TED theme going on here, because I didn't mention in my introduction that HEAL's founding patron is Ted Green. So he's had mention from two of us up here on the stage. And the first thing Ted made me really understand, because I'm not a soil scientist or microbiologist, is just how critical the health of the soil is. And in fact, an American president said, a nation that destroys its soil destroys itself. And I think that's so true. And you're all sitting on this amazing rainforest. I hadn't thought of that, just where you're sitting. So yes, we're looking for ecologically depleted land that over time, and nature's time, not our time, we want it to happen fast, and there will be changes. So for those of you that know the Knepp estate in Sussex, the restoration of their soil has been quite dramatic. Their worm numbers, the state of their soil organic carbon is a lot better than control sites on arable farms outside. So one of the things that we know is letting nature lead again. Nature is what created the healthy soils that we are all after. So if nature is in charge and you fill in any gaps in the processes, particularly bringing in large herbivores, so we're talking about cattle, ponies and pigs, for example, which they have at Knepp, those animals help to restore soil function through their natural behaviours. And it's a complex subject, but yes, so we're looking for depleted sites that we can make healthy again, make whole again.
And these sites have obviously become depleted as a result of intensively used, commercially led, industrialised farming. Does that make your ambition to rewild these landscapes something of a subversive act? I mean, do you feel that you have forces not wanting you to go ahead and popularise this idea? There's going to be massive sales, if everybody sort of just kind of uptake these ideas, even to a small proportion on the land that was owned. That would have an enormous impact.
Subversive act, that's really interesting. We haven't been called a subversive act, but that's a really interesting phrase. What I would say is that the direction of travel for land use in this country is to restore nature on a decent amount of it, because there are 233 countries and territories in the world where the state of nature is better than here. So if you look at an index of poverty of nature, we are 234th, which is astounding. And it's because we're heavily populated, man has worked the land for millennia. So I would say there are so many people doing what we're doing. The National Trust is doing it, the RSPB is doing it, Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust is doing it, private landowners are doing it. Across the nation, we are part of this big collaboration of people who want to have more places where nature can return. So I think there are a lot of people being subversive, and also it does align with what the government want. The government have set targets that they want 30% of land to be nature based by 2030, I think is the year. And so we're part of this movement, this shift of change back to regenerative systems in agriculture and nature restoration, where land is used with nature as the reason for its management.
Okay, thank you. And John, what impact does this soil depletion have on trees?
So as I talked about before, they're fully dependent on each other. So trees, as we've talked about, and all plants actually, they have associations with the mycorrhizae and the bacteria and other organisms that live within the soil in order to function. And actually, when tree roots grow, they're generally sort of covered in a sheath of mycorrhizal fungi, which expand the surface area of those roots enormously. And not only do they give those roots the opportunity to take in water and nutrients in a way that they couldn't do if they were living on their own, but they also provide protection against other more detrimental fungal pathogens and other things that might damage those trees. So they have a really close symbiotic relationship. And what the fungi get in return from those trees is the sugars that the trees create through photosynthesis go back down into the mycorrhizal fungi and provide them with those sugars that they need to survive. So it's a really complex interaction, and when that function starts to break down, as you might imagine, the whole thing suffers, the whole system suffers. So without healthy soils and without those two things interacting in the right way, then actually we've got a real problem. And I think we can see, we are seeing already the effects of climate change. It's not something that's going to happen, it's happening right now to us. And we see that through a number of different factors, but with trees in particular, with pests and diseases that are coming through, with changes to the climate and drought stresses, trees are under stress. And it means that they are more susceptible to going into decline and to suffering from various ailments that without those fungal associations of mycorrhizae and healthy soils to bed into, they're only ever going to be more susceptible to those pests and diseases and those climate change sort of factors that they wouldn't be able to cope with. So really for all of us, it's absolutely crucial in terms of trees and woodlands that we think about the very thing that they sit upon and stand in.
Okay, so Jan, you mentioned this idea of regenerative approaches. So this is a question to all of you. What is a regenerative system in agriculture, forestry, and land use? John, maybe you could start. What would a regenerative approach to forestry be?
Yes, so I think it's interesting hearing the conversation about sort of land use choice, and it's something that we're in the National Trust really acutely aware of. I mean, we have responsibilities to a wide range of stakeholders, as you might imagine. But our central tenet of all of our activity is really we manage our land for people, we manage our land to mitigate climate change, and we manage our land for nature. And all of those things, not always in balance. We do flex those objectives, but they are our primary purpose, and that's what we're trying to do. And I think when we talk about whether it's regenerative agriculture, forestry, rewilding, we often talk about these in binary ways, and they don't need to be binary. And actually, places like NEP, for example, who have done some amazing work around rewilding their land, but actually they still have longhorn beef grazing through there, and that longhorn beef sells for really great sort of lucrative markets into London for really good quality beef. So you can have excellent rewilding, excellent nature benefits, but you can still provide food as well at the same time. And I think the one thing that we should be mindful of in terms of land availability is the fact that almost 80% of our calories are produced in the UK on 20% of our land. So that gives us the option to free up a huge amount of our land where we can prioritise nature at its best. And I think in terms of woodland creation in particular, I think there's no one size fits all. So we can use trees in a multitude of different ways, whether it's from agroforestry, so helping productive farmers diversify from maybe those more intensive type activities into ones that use trees, have soil protection, have nature as a higher priority, but still allow them to carry on productive farming enterprises, right the way through to rewilding and using natural colonisation and natural processes to drive woodland creation and to drive tree establishment. So, as I say, it isn't an and or an if. It's kind of a range of different things that we can do and apply depending on what the objectives for that particular site is.
Okay, and same question to you, Jan. What would a regenerative approach to land use look and feel like?
For me, thinking of it rather than a technical term for farming, which it is, and I'm not a regenerative farmer, but it's the idea that you improve the health of the land while you use it for the purpose that you have chosen. And where that purpose is nature, that's a relatively straightforward proposition. Where that purpose is food production, it becomes more complex. Where that purpose is a solar farm or a golf course or a military range, there are lots of other ways that land is used. I think that becomes more difficult. But somewhere in there is a chance for everyone to improve the health of some or all of the land that they're managing. And my knowledge of regenerative farming is still improving, but my understanding of it is it combines particularly mob grazing. So it's back to some of the principles where you would have cattle in a certain area and then you would move them on. That you allow your land to be fallow some of the time, that you don't dig or till. So if any of you have an allotment, and I did a talk on allotments on Zoom, and I said, if you have an allotment, you shouldn't be digging it. And there was an audible intake of shocked breath when people, this wonderful double digging, I'm going to hurt my back thing was a thing of the past. So not tilling, direct drilling, mob grazing, agroforestry, having pasture with orchards. It's a really exciting area, and I don't know enough about it yet, but there are some farmers doing amazing work. So Martin Lyons is a farmer, I'm trying to think which county he's in, but in Bedfordshire? Cambridgeshire, that's right. And he's running the Nature Friendly Farming Network. And when we get a site, we want to be surrounded by a community of land use where they're interested in being friendly towards nature. But yeah, regenerative agriculture is really a subject worth looking at because it should be the future for farming and food production as that production shifts, as we consume less meat, I think, which will happen over a period of time, and balance the land use more.
And same question to you, Toby. Jan mentioned this idea of no-dig farming. Is that something that can be scaled up?
Yeah, definitely. So, one thing I forgot to mention is actually that my wife Bella and I run a farm down in Devon. It's 110 acres.
It's quite a big thing to forget to mention.
Yeah.
Probably takes up quite a lot of your life, doesn't it?
Yeah, it takes up, certainly.
So how do you approach this idea of regenerative farming on your own farm?
Yeah. I think, we regeneratively farm, I suppose, if you wanted to sort of put it into a box, as it were. To give you a tiny overview of our farm, we're on the Culm Measures near a little village called Witheridge, quite near the town of Tiverton. The Culm Measures is an area of land, it's actually a national character area, where some of the most special and amazingly rich grassland and woodland systems interweave, or used to, across a huge high area of Devon. And that would have been interspersed with these gorgeous Atlantic oak woods, some of which we still have remnants of quite near us, which is really lucky. To just tackle the regenerative farming thing, I think, I was reading a book the other day about a Cherokee chief who said that the purpose of life is to look after the land that you live on for 6 generations beyond the life that you live. And I suppose that is the ultimate kind of answer to the idea of regenerative farming. We're in a regenerative period because the depletion has got to a level where we really have nowhere to go, I think, chemically. or at least if we do it, it will only just get worse. And as a consequence, the only option we really have on a grand scale is to regenerate. But I hope that where we can one day get to is to a position of growing from wherever the soil health was once in terms of its richness. And I think we use a sort of a hybrid of conservation and holistic planned grazing, where we, in the summer during the growth periods, move our animals relentlessly, as if you would as a herder practicing the concept of transhumance, which was where they used to drive animals up into higher pastures to get the best grazing, and then they would fall back down again. And in a similar way, many of the habitats that we manage are very much responding unbelievably well to that process of transhumance, but at exactly the same time, we're noticing that the soil biology and the soil health and the function of the soil is increasing year on year. And so, where do I wrap up? It's such a massive...
Why is that exactly? Is that because of the kind of the cows, the
Yeah,
herds
so-
are fertilising the soil or not overgrazing them?
Yes, well, exactly. So one thing that's happening is that a lot of herbaceous plants, so the wonderful wildflower meadows that some or all of us have probably visited, are in a process of rest and recovery after a disturbance. But that disturbance has happened once, and it has happened quickly, and it has happened very, very aggressively, actually. And a lot of the biomass that has been grown has been removed, either by a hay cutter, in the old days somebody scything to make hay, or in the case of mob grazing, through the animals moving as a herd. And I suppose what you're trying to mimic is this proxy of wild landscapes where there would have been sometimes multiple types of apex predators doggedly harrying groups of animals which were the herbivores. And you essentially re-engineer their whole mentality to become part of the system like they once would have had to have been part of it, because there was somebody exerting top-down pressure on them, whether that was a wolf or a bear, or even lynx predating calves, or however that occurred. And so in our system, that's what we're trying to do, but we take every single cue from what the wild system shows us as it recovers. The farm was an intensive dairy farm. We've now got well over 100 species across the farm. Some of them were already there, but we've restored multiple hectares of calm grassland. We've just done another 25 hectare restoration up on an area which is right at the beginning of its process. And you know, people talk about this idea of productivity. Well, the productivity is going up and up and up, but it is balanced across the entire set of levels of biology, which is the difference between trying to force all of the energy into a single crop. And so obviously our business model is transferred now. We're selling high quality beef, just like we were talking about. We're also selling wildflower hay. If anybody wants a cash cow right now, get into wildflower hay, because everyone wants to restore wildflowers and there's not many meadows left. So that's you know, exciting, and it's wonderful to think that, again, just bring it back to a sort of conclusion, that we are now farming within our system. And if we ever find a breaking point, like we have too many animals, we will just step back from it and go back to a period of restoration, because that's the ultimate way of establishing a sustainable food security and future. So.
Okay, thank you. And it's generally understood that the release of carbon and carbon dioxide is one of the kind of key factors to the impending climate crisis that we're facing. What role do our soils play in mitigating a climate crisis by locking in carbon? And how is our sort of industrialised farming system kind of contributing to it?
Yeah, so as we've talked about, you know, our soils are in a huge state of depletion, and the amount of organic matter that's contained within them in many cases is at minuscule levels. So the ability for soils to lock up carbon are really quite huge, at least in the short term, because they will reach an equilibrium relatively quickly in terms of that initial sequestration. But if we go to try and restore our soils in the way that we've talked about, then they have a huge potential to lock up carbon whilst they replace that organic matter that's been lost. Peat soils are slightly different. When we talk about peat, it's really about peat degradation. So what we're seeing is with many of our upland peat sites, or even lowland peat sites, those sites are in a really poor condition, and therefore they're emitting carbon dioxide as that peat breaks down and oxidises. So what we're trying to do with peat soils in particular is to halt that decline and re-wet many of those soils so they then stop emitting carbon, but then start to sequester it. But they do sequester it at a really slow rate. So just to be clear, so peatlands is about stopping emissions more so than actually sequestration in itself. And the great thing, and I would come back to this because I'm a forester and I talk about trees, but the great thing about forests is the fact that you get a double whammy almost with trees and soil. So you not only get sequestration of carbon in the soil underneath the trees, but trees have this ability to suck up carbon above the ground as well. But trees indeed as well also in woodlands reach an equilibrium unless we continue to manage them, because all these systems are they're in a cycle. So eventually, no matter how many sort of human interventions we might make, they will reach a plateau. So, we can do all of these amazing things, working with nature to start to sequester more carbon, but ultimately it doesn't remove our obligation to reduce the amount of carbon that we actually consume and emit. So these are not long-term solutions in the truest sense if we're talking tree time, 100, 200, 300 years, but they are short-term solutions that allow us to buy some time while we actually get our house in order.
Mm.
Did you want to say something?
Yeah, just to say that I didn't know this until a few years ago, but there are people who are ecosystem carbon specialists, and we have volunteers at Heath, and this chap came doing his PhD, and he modelled if we were to buy a site that began as 100% arable, what the carbon sequestration would be over 20 years, and if we began with a site that was all grazing land, grassland, what would the sequestration be? And it was really striking how relatively, not little exactly, but the number of tonnes sequestered on a grazing land site is quite small. It's back to this idea that it's already reached its peak, really. Whereas if you start with arable land, but then arable land is food production land. So generally speaking, rewilding we'll be looking for, if we can, grazing land or largely grazing land sites. But yeah, and I think of tree time, and I think of the tree as a solar panel, which is one of Ted's ideas. That you've got solar panels all around, and we have to remember what an amazing job trees do. But I think remembering that trees can reproduce themselves, that's what they're there for. As well. So many of you may think that, in fact, Ed Sheeran has said that tree planting and rewilding are the same. Some rewilding sites plant trees because there are no parent trees, but if you came somewhere like here and you were going to rewild this field, you would want the trees to reproduce themselves if you possibly could. So, yeah, and reduction, totally agree. We have to reduce what we personally and in our systems, in our commercial systems, produce to get to where we need to get to.
This issue, obviously, as human beings, we're the only species to contribute to soil depletion. Is that right, generally? So, I mean, this is a very human issue. How do we really get people to connect with this idea, the fundamental importance of soil, to understand it and to care for it? And I'd imagine that's something that you're trying to put forward through Heath Rewilding.
When I read that the Eden project is going to put plastic grass down to stop children getting muddy, I was really sad about that. So helping people to understand. I mean, I don't want to be rose-coloured about it because there are pathogens in soil. They're not. It's not a. But there's also some evidence that, children back in the day would have played in the mud, and children's health has changed over time. Who know? I'm not an expert. I don't know, but I've certainly heard from people say that when children are playing in muddy places, that has a positive effect upon their health. Connecting is really about understanding where all life starts.
There are actually studies that show that when children play in playgrounds with trees, their own microbiota is enhanced as a result of it.
Yeah.
So that human nature connection is not just a nice to have; it's fundamental for our own well-being. Yeah,
you don't walk through a forest and come out unaffected by the products of that forest. It's extraordinary, not even aware of it. But it is about seeing a buttercup. I saw one of the children here doing the buttercup under the chin. It's that connection. if our children don't, you have to have a connection, and you're here, and I think you do because you're in this talk, but just to remind people just how much the ground they stand on and the sun that shines down are the givers of life.
Okay, thank you. So we're heading towards the end of our panel discussion. I'd just like to ask each of you kind of one thing. Could you tell the audience one project or scheme or location that gives you hope that respect and care for our soils is taking place? So just something that people can go away and investigate. Is there one location, one project? Maybe Toby.
I mean, I'd obviously plug one that I'm doing.
Self-promotion.
The Welling Deck project. Okay. Yeah. I mean, that's from ground zero, but I think one of my great friends, Alex Cherry, runs the Groundswell Conference. And if you want to get your head into soil in a big way, some of the very best of the world go to Groundswell. They don't just do Groundswell the conference. His uncle, John Cherry, who occasionally is in the papers, has been a regenerative farmer and has practiced mob grazing and zero till and diverse cover cropping for, I think, probably nearly 20 years now. So there's a very strong knowledge of what they bring to the table when they're actually putting forward these ideas. So that is a farm where it is farming, and they're farming to create food. And yet I went there the other day, walked around with him. I've never seen more English partridges on wild land or arable land. So they're doing something right.
Thank you. Jan.
There is an organisation called Rewilding Britain, and they have a network. And if you go onto their website, you will see a map of every rewilding site in the country, not just England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. And any of those sites would be a place where you could find hope. And the one thing that rewilding represents for many people is hope. And to go to these places and see the joy of the changes, the positive changes in front of you, so you have lots of places to choose from.
And John?
Well, I'm inspired by my colleagues in the Trust all the time. Every time I'm fortunate and privileged enough to go out on a site visit, there's always something that amazes me. So there's a huge amount of work going on in the Trust, which almost any property you could visit and you could see a version of it. But I won't choose a Trust one. I was lucky to visit a place called Carrickfergus Wildwood up in the Scottish borders recently. And what's very interesting about that is the fact that it's a planted woodland. So it's a sort of rewilding of the valley, but done very much with a human intervention, because that seed source that we talked about just wasn't there. And it just amazed me. 20 years ago, that site was planted, and yet you can walk off the main road between Moffat and Selkirk, and I'm not saying that's like Clapham High Street or something like that, so it's a relatively quiet road, but you can feel like you're in a space of real wilderness within 20 yards off that road, and a place that is really inspiring to see how nature is recovering in those places, particularly the soils underneath as well. And that's a site I would really recommend if you're ever going north. Often say people don't stop in South Scotland, but do make the short detour to visit that one, because it's wonderful.
Lovely, thank you. And we're just going to wrap up now. There is a certain sense that it's not our individual responsibilities to look after soil. We're talking about farms and rewilding sites and forests, that whilst we can appreciate them, it sort of becomes a little bit disconnected. So what advice would you give to us in the audience as consumers, as kind of people who live on the planet, to get involved, to make better choices? Do you have any suggestions for the audience? I'll start with Toby.
Yeah, so I've been through this process myself, and I know that it is sometimes long and arduous, but it is the best way as far as I can see, and that is to just be an incredibly conscious consumer. And it's as simple as that. Work out which farms through any number of the channels. Instagram's actually amazing, where people are doing things that they're very, very proud of. You very rarely find people posting about blitzing a field with glyphosate. You very regularly find people posting about how they're managing their animals and, oh my gosh, look, there's 20 pied wagtails following along behind us. And those are the farms that are creating food for the country, that are going through all number of channels to get to market, who are crying out for as much support as they can get, because it's a really awesome thing that they're doing. So
Okay, conscious consumerism and a little bit of kind of time on Instagram.
yeah.
Good. It's going to be a good thing. Okay, Jan.
Please don't buy any compost with peat in it. And I'm pleased to see garden centres gradually shifting, but they still sell peat-based compost, which I think is an absolute disgrace. And Heath has a scheme where you can sponsor a 3 metre by 3 metre square of land that will have a What 3 Words address, which is an addressing system, on our foundation site, which will be in the south of England, and our second site in the north, for £20. So for £20 you will sponsor, that will be the piece of land with your name on it. So that's how you could connect to something real that helps the soil.
Lovely. I mean, I think it's a really nice, very accessible way of getting involved, isn't it? In an affordable way.
Heath 3x3.
John.
Well, some great comments about sort of consumer choices, and as colleagues have said on the panel, those are not always easy, but I think they are vital. But I'll go for something slightly different. And a lot of us are lucky enough to have gardens or allotments or various other things. And my advice would be avoid that human tendency to tidy. That would be what I would suggest that you do. We're all obsessed with clipping our lawn or with tidying up dead wood or weeding and all these other things that we have this aesthetic view of how things should look. So avoid that tendency to tidy, and we can all do a little bit of that for a little bit of the year.
I'm only too happy to do less tidying in the garden. Okay. Thank you. So we've got about 10 minutes now for questions. Got Bex over on the far side with a roving microphone. I think we've got a question coming in from Ted here, first of all. So if you've got your questions ready, put your hands up after Ted's question's been answered.
I recommend you read Wilding, not Rewilding. Wilding by Isabella Tree. Okay, definitely read that, because it takes me back. I call her the Rachel Carson of this generation, because I date back, obviously, to the days of Rachel Carson, who really set the ball rolling when she pointed out what had happened when the world started to use industrial pesticides and fertilizers, herbicides and insecticides and the rest of it. And I picked that book up the other day, and I could only read the first page. I can't read it anymore, because to me, very, very little has changed in the agricultural world, certainly. And then we talked about food. So I came up with a phrase, and I say there's real food and there's FUD. Real food, obviously, is organic food. FUD is frightening, unhealthy, and dangerous. And that's what most of us eat. And of course, we don't want a population. Who wants a world full of 90-year-olds? And it's working towards that way of getting rid of a few of you. But the other one was, we talked about soil erosion, and whenever I get a chance, I raise the word flood mud. Because at the moment, if you read in the media and certainly on television, every year you will see water rushing through a town. Yeah? Is it water? No, it's mud. And they sweep mud out of their houses. Now, if we change that word flood water to flood mud, then it's no longer an engineering problem to get the flood mud down to the sea. It becomes a farming problem. And there were, in Countryfile the other day, they had a farmer on there who was bleating on about the fact that the ditches and the streams hadn't been desilted by the council and all the rest of it. But what the interviewer should have said, well, excuse me, where did that silt come from? That's your land. And so I finish up by saying that really what we should be saying and stressing is that the land may be owned by the landowner, but the soil has to belong to the nation. I could go on for hours, by the way.
I think clearly Ted is something of an inspiration for our panellists, and clearly a font of amazing knowledge. I think we should give him a little round of applause, actually.
Yeah.
Just thank you for thank you for coming, Ted. Thank you. Time for a couple more questions. Lady in the black and white shirt.
Yes, thank you very much for a fascinating talk from all of you. I remember at school learning about crop rotation in my medieval history. And I've been curious about, I understand that industrial farming is about bringing down the cost of food, about producing enough food for a huge amount of people. But I wondered about the old idea of crop rotation and why are we able to bring back that kind of medieval form of farming so that we could produce enough food at a price that we could all afford, and are we doing that?
Would anybody like to take that?
I'll have a go,
Knowledgeable, yeah.
because it's a big question, isn't it? So I'm reading for the third time an amazing book by a guy called Masanobu Fukuoka called The One Straw Revolution.
You said that a bit more slowly.
Sorry, yeah. Masanobu Fukuoka, The One Straw Revolution. His research, well, so I fundamentally believe that we can grow just as much food organically, or however you want to class it, with just as well, if not better, which would support soil health, and I think actually the price of food wouldn't change that much. I think basically what we need to reinsert ourselves with is the knowledge of things like crop rotation, but more importantly that you are building a resource below ground year on year as a farmer. And so to go a little bit more into what Masanobu Fukuoka did, he actually worked for the Institute of Pests and Diseases, I believe, for one of the precincts in Japan. And there was a moment in his life where he thought, I can't believe that I'm seeing the rice paddies being sprayed like this. Or I can't quite remember exactly what happened, but it basically made him think, why do we all keep putting so much effort, and nowadays effort equals diesel, into our farming system, when actually, as we've talked about, nature can quite categorically take care of itself. Now his road to producing more bushels of grain, more bushels of rice rather, on an annual basis to any of the chemical farmers in the same valley as him was definitely not easy. He got things wrong, he planted seeds at the wrong time, they were eaten by pests, blah, 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 blah. And I'm not necessarily saying that tomorrow everybody just has to go off chemicals, because unfortunately we're at this stage now where we'll have to wean ourselves off, and even some of the regenerative agricultural farmers that I know are still utilising inorganic fertiliser to maintain a yield which is even seen as plausible. But if we begin this process of restoration with the concept of things like crop rotation, although even in Masanobu's book he's growing rice in the same field year on year, but because of all of the other plants which are supporting the rice, the soil biology is unchanged. It doesn't become depleted by only growing a single plant. And subsequently, utilising those kinds of moments in time, those incredible people who've decided to go completely against the logic of the time, I fundamentally believe, and I think I almost have to believe, for the sake of the planet and the nature which we all absolutely, the wildlife we completely adore, that is totally possible. And that's what we're trying to pioneer in England on our farm, using a lot of the principles that he has. But I would welcome every arable farmer to start doing it, because I believe that it is completely logical, and you will leave your son or daughter a land which is gaining in richness every year, which is exactly what he did, and like I say, the proof was in the pudding. The final point to say about it is that he was selling his products cheaper into all of his markets, not because he thought that he didn't think he should be selling them more expensive, because he was actually doing so much less to get the product to market. And yeah, the fruits might not have been perfect, but the flavour was remarkable. Yeah. And so I just don't believe that we need to be doing what we're doing. I think it's actually much more exciting to think about doing it that way.
Great, thank you. So, any other questions? Gentleman with the hat. Oh, sorry, you might need to just wait for the microphone so everyone can hear. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me? John, mainly. I've got ancient woodland site, and it's 80% ash, of which I think 80% are dying this year. And I'm felling a lot of trees. I just wondered, I have been replanting a variety of other trees, but it would seem to suggest that you might just leave the woodland with the 20% oak or whatever it is and some hawthorn. Would you leave it or would you replant?
So that's a really good question, and ash dieback is such a catastrophic disease for us to deal with. I mean, ash makes up about 40% of our native woodland species canopy, and with ash dieback we're predicting that we'll lose anything between sort of 70% and 95% of our ash trees across the landscape, depending on the woodland that we have. But there is a key point to the question, which is that actually there is some genetic resilience within ash trees. It's not like Dutch elm, which is elm trees have a much narrower sort of genetic spread within them. Ash trees are more diverse naturally than other trees like elm. So therefore, there is a chance that, you know, somewhere between 25 to 5% of the natural ash population will survive through ash dieback. So therefore, it's really important that we give those remaining trees the opportunity to regenerate and to recolonise wherever possible. So my advice is really, if at all possible, is to leave as many of those for as long as possible that you can to allow that regeneration to start to take place. Of course, if there are safety issues, if you've got trees that are going to pose a risk to either yourself or to the public, then we have to take action. But otherwise, I think allowing nature to really drive that regeneration process, I think is really important. There's only one thing that I would say about that, though, is that many of our ash woodlands are they're artificial. You know, they've been managed in a certain way that creates this monoculture of ash that we see either through new planting or through industrial usage. And I do think ash dieback does create, on a positive side, the opportunity to create some greater diversity within some of these native woodlands. And there are species that we can choose that are underrepresented in some of our woodlands. You know, think about sort of lime trees in particular. I'd love to see more lime trees in our landscape. And even the possibility of introducing, you know, some trees which perhaps haven't been so palatable before. So things like sycamore do have a place as long as we treat them with a degree of caution. All of which allow us to diversify our woodlands. And when we're thinking about climate change and resilience, one of the things that really springs to my mind is creating a diverse palette of different species. We've talked about it within farming and soils, and woodlands are no different. We want a diverse palette of species within our woodlands. So yes, allow regeneration to take place, but maybe do a little bit of planting that provides species and introduces species into your woodland that aren't already there.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more question. Gentleman at the front here.
Back at the beginning of the pandemic, something quite wonderful happened in our local council in that they stopped cutting the grass. And so I don't know whether anyone else experienced this, but for about a year it was truly peaceful, grasslands, you know, you could hear the wildlife, there were obviously more insects about. And I'm sure most of us are kind of guilty of having our monoculture lawn as our borough councils, and because like we're saying, we spend a lot of carbon maintaining this stuff. Is there anything we can simply do other than being conscious consumers and that sort of thing? Is there a method for, say, dumping lawns and leveraging our councils to stop cutting the grass?
I've got some, yeah.
I was just going to say there's a great campaign at the moment, No Mow May, which we should all get behind, and that's specifically designed, all of us actually, what we can do in our gardens and how we can persuade our local authorities, councils and so on to just do exactly that. So particularly in May, we will look around us and we see the flowers that we can see in the fields here, and you know, allowing them to really do their own thing, I think is incredibly sort of important and a very simple act that we can all take. So.
Yeah. Just to say that, to remember that mowing is done by contractors who have been hired by the council. Their contracts will come to an end at some point. If you know your local councillor and you can suggest that when the contracts are renewed, certain places are mowed less. But the one thing that upsets a lot of people is untidiness. And it's a really simple solution. If where we were sitting was a verge, the council have to mow the first half a metre or a couple of feet, and then people know it's deliberate. and put a sign up quite often. So it's education, a sign that it's deliberate, and lobby your councillors, because they are the ones who control the mowing. And at your own place, if you don't want a play area, then mow paths through your lawn and then see what happens. It's magical.
And this is important but challenging stuff for lots of people. Like I said, it's kind of subversive.
Yeah, it's a good word.
Oh, Ted's got a quote. Final quote from Ted.
The most banal pursuit known to Western educated man is trying to make a piece of grass like his dining room carpet. And when it comes to tidiness, when did you stop being untidy as a teenager and become tidy? So my advice is miss out middle age.
Good advice. Thank you. So that's about all we've got time for. It strikes me, I'm coming at all of this from a spatial design, architectural, interior design background, and my speciality is in biophilic design, but it really strikes me that the way we design and create spaces is something that should be a model for the way that we treat and create and deal with our soils. You know, to create a healthy, active space, we need for people to be happy in, it needs to be sheltered. We need to create time for rest and recuperation. We need to incorporate sunshine and light, clean water with no chemicals. We need to create spaces with fresh air. We need to create biodiverse conditions and also a sense of community. And all of these ideas apply to our soils, as we've heard from these kind of inspirational experts today. So I think if we were just to think about how we would create spaces for ourselves and treat ourselves in a similar way, it would be a good model for progressing forward. That is my sort of final summation. I'd just like to thank our three fantastic speakers, Toby, Jan and John. So if we could have a round of applause, please. Or a whelp and a bit of barking. Thank you.
I'll take that.
Yeah,
I think that's happiness, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's informed barking. And also just to thank the National Trust for hosting us, Planted Country, and of course our friends at Out of the Valley. If you'd like to know more about the cabins, do come in, take a look. There's some brochures in here as well. Thank you all for joining us. My name's Oliver Heath, and this has been Planted Country, Why Earth Matters. Thank you very much.
Very good.
Good job.